The Old Testament is at the origin of a religion, Judaism. But the well-known stories contained in this book, which is also called the Hebrew Bible, also recount a history, that of the creation of the world and of the people of Israel. How much of this biblical text is history and how much is legend? Israel Finkelstein and Neil Siberman continue their investigations into the society that wrote the Old Testament. We meet up with them again in Megiddo. In previous episodes, they showed that the Bible's most famous stories, those of Abraham, the patriarchs, or the Exodus, when the ancient Israelites left Egypt, were first put into writing in the 7th century BC, in the heart of the Judahite Hills. It was here that most of the stories contained in the Bible were written down. They bring to life a complex antique world, full of noise and passion, of conflicts and alliances, of heroes and conquests. A story similar to that of all peoples, but one that in this case gave birth to a unique book. In this episode, we are going to explore the origins of the nation that first put the text of the Bible into writing. According to the biblical text, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt to the land of Canaan, the Holy Land. We see them reconquer the lands of their ancestors and gradually become a sovereign people in their land.
The first verses of the book of Joshua say the following. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' minister, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land which I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. This is the beginning of the great saga, the great epic of the conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua. And the Bible tells the story step by step, from here to Jericho, from Jericho to Ai, from Ai to the war with the kings of the south, and then to Hazor and the kings of the north. And it's a wonderful story, a great saga of war and conquest and bravery. And the question is, did it happen? Did it really happen the way it is described in the text of the Bible, of the book of Joshua?
The Bible describes Joshua primarily as a military leader who was given a mission by God to conquer the land that was promised to the patriarchs and then to Moses. Joshua invaded the territory of Canaan at the head of an enormous army of confederated Israelite tribes. He crossed the Jordan River and attacked and conquered the region's cities one after the other in a lightning war. These conquered cities formed the outlines of a country.
The biblical version presents this conquest as a sort of blitzkrieg. In all, it took 2 weeks, and practically the whole of the population was exterminated. No mercy was shown for the people of Canaan. But we are not told why. We are not told that it was because they worshipped false gods or because they were particularly evil. On the contrary, no reasons are given. What is important is that they were all devoted to destruction, according to the biblical text. The word used is harem, which means that everything must be destroyed in order to be given back to Yahweh. The idea is that God grants them victory, so everything therefore belongs to God.
The conquest followed by the dividing up of Canaan are at the heart of the biblical book of Joshua. According to biblical chronology, this incident occurred in the second half of the 13th century BC. Archaeologists have located and excavated most of the cities referred to in the story. It is therefore necessary to take a closer look at these excavations. The most important site for this part of our investigation is Hazor in Galilee. The Bible describes this as a high-ranking city, the head of all those kingdoms. The archaeological site is being examined by Amnon Ben Tor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is continuing a task that was begun in the 1950s by the famous archaeologist Yigael Yadin. Some of the remains discovered here are considered to be those of a palace and a temple destroyed in the 13th century BC by a violent conflagration.
And look at the destruction. We are in the entrance to the Hatzor palace of the late Bronze Age, or Canaanite Hatzor. Look at the signs of the destruction, which are to be found everywhere. Look at the melted mud brick. It takes 1300 degrees centigrade to melt a mud brick. Look at the intense heat marked all over the bricks. Look at the white here, which is also an effect of the fire. Look at the wood, the timber. All those signs of the violent destruction of the palace of Hatzor. Look at the cracked basalt stones. Look at this. Normal heat doesn't do this, only a very, very intense fire. Look at what is happening on the walls. See the ashes, see the wood, signs of the timber here, on the walls. Wherever you look, wherever you go, same signs of destruction.
These layers of destruction appear to provide tangible evidence of the conquest of Canaan by the armies of Joshua. Given the mood of 1950s Israel just after the country's independence, this hypothesis supported the idea that the birth of a nation had to be preceded by a military conquest.
Joshua's destruction of Hazor, the great city of North Canaan referred to in the Bible, was a key step in the conquest of Galilee by the Israelites. Dr. Yadin and his colleagues are hoping to reach the lair where we find the destroyed city. In 3 seasons of excavations, they have already found the remains of a number of Israelite cities that were successively built on the ruins of previous cities. They have discovered precious relics that add to our knowledge of the story and of the way people lived in those times. The Hazor excavation, which will be completed next summer, adds an impressive new chapter to biblical research and to universal knowledge of ancient history, of the link between the Jewish people and the land of Israel.
There was a great enthusiasm for archaeology during this period by a country in search of history. Its leaders, David Ben-Gurion, who was at that time prime minister, and former military leaders such as Yigael Yadin or Moshe Dayan. The facts seem to speak for themselves. Similar remains of destruction were to be found in many of the country's archaeological sites. However, the accumulation of conflicting data over the past 50 years sowed the first seeds of doubt. We therefore have to go back to the beginning and re-examine site by site the foundations of the hypothesis of the conquest of the country by Joshua and his armies. It is necessary to refer to the text and the story of the conquest as it is related in the Bible, in particular its most famous battle, that of Jericho. An impressive amount of information is available in relation to Jericho. It is one of the most excavated sites of the Levant. Several expeditions have succeeded each other there since the beginning of the 20th century. How does the Bible tell the story of the capture of Jericho? Everyone is familiar with the method that was used to cause the walls of the city to come tumbling down, the famous trumpets of Jericho. Go round the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. When you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the walls of the city shall fall flat down. Basing themselves on the Bible, the first researchers believed that some of the remains that were discovered here were those of the city destroyed during the attack by the Israelite armies. But these ruins predate the 13th century BC. The archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon was the first to conclude that at the time suggested by the Bible, there were no walls in Jericho that needed tumbling down. At the time of the conquest of Canaan, Jericho was unoccupied. We therefore have to reconsider all of these elements from another perspective.
So this is not history in the simple sense, and the case of Jericho applies also for other places mentioned in the tradition of the conquest in the book of Joshua. Many of the cities mentioned were not inhabited at all in the late Bronze Age. There was nothing there.
There is another inconsistency. Archaeologists' examination of all the different sites that have been excavated show that the process of destruction was spread over almost a century. In contrast, the Bible refers to a very short-lived operation. While certain cities were indeed destroyed, they were not all destroyed at the same time. What to do now? We have to widen our point of view and take into account the geopolitical situation of the Levant during the same 13th century, and focus on the main player of the period, Egypt. Almost 400 cuneiform tablets dating from the 14th century BC have been discovered in Tel El Amarna in Middle Egypt. They include certain information about the region that we are concerned with. They consist of diplomatic correspondence sent to the pharaohs by the kings of the small city-states of Canaan. A reading of the correspondence shows that the city-states were vassals of Egypt during the relevant period. In fact, from the 15th century to the beginning of the 12th century BC, the land of Canaan was an Egyptian province. Egypt occupied the country, where it set up a network of strongholds. This has been confirmed by the archaeological excavations. One of those strongholds was excavated in the 1920s at Beth Shean, south of the Sea of Galilee. The Amarna letters and the archaeological excavations clearly show that Beth Shean, whose biblical mound dominates the Roman and Byzantine ruins, was an important Egyptian bastion between the 14th and mid-12th centuries.
To understand the way the Egyptians dominated completely the country and the countryside, you have to come here. To a residency like this, there was a strong garrison, there were scribes here, there were soldiers here, there were administrators here, and everything was under the control of the Egyptians, which means that 20 kilometers from here, 30 kilometers from here, if somebody wanted to take some sort of a major economic decision or a major political decision, he needed to come to Beth Shean to get the approval of the Egyptians. They were the masters of the countryside. According to the traditional biblical archaeology, the conquest took place in the late 13th century, in the time of Ramses II. And we have two problems here. The first one is that at that time, Beth Shean was a very strong Egyptian stronghold with soldiers, with the people that could have been dispatched from here to block any invasion of Canaan. And the second problem is that the Egyptians are still here, about a century after the traditional date of the conquest. How can it be?
So, the archaeological excavations tell us that the conquest did not take place. However, two questions remain unanswered. How can we explain the evidence of destruction that has been found in many of the sites? And what meaning can we give to the list of supposedly conquered cities that are cited in the biblical text? Our investigation will shortly provide the answers.
So the book of Joshua is not history. It's a mythical description. And like the case of the patriarchs and the case of Exodus, it tells the story of the formative stage in the life of the nation. And as such, it is full of divine interventions, bravery, and miracles.
The biblical text tells how, at the request of Joshua, God would help the Israelites win their battle in an entirely miraculous way. He extended the day during the battle by ordering the sun to stand still on Gibeon and the moon to stop in the valley of Ajalon. And the biblical text goes on to say that there was no day like that before it or after it, that Yahweh listened to the voice of a man.
The Joshua epic is the start of a great story that ends up in a story of kingship. The book of Joshua is in fact the Bible's first installment of a story that would ultimately show why Israel chose a king in the same way that other peoples had done. But it didn't happen overnight. Joshua already prefigures in the Bible as being slightly royal, as he is treated somewhat like a king. But after the story of Joshua, we find a book called the Book of Judges. They were charismatic leaders who arose during a period that was chaotic and anarchical, a period in which nothing was determined. There was no central power, and, quote, every man did that which was right in his own eyes, according to the formula used in the book. So the Book of Judges is used to show that it is not possible to organize a nation in the absence of a king or a central power. The Book of Judges ends on that finding. It is followed by the story of Samuel, which is the introduction to the history of kingship. Samuel would be the one to choose first Saul and then David as the king of Israel.
David. The biblical text presents David as a herder who was anointed by God. Hence the word Mashiach, or Messiah in Hebrew, the Anointed One. But did David really exist? Many doubt it. An inscription discovered at Tel Dan provides the answer. It refers to a king of Damascus whose defeated enemies included Ahaziah, king of the house of David.
So this is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, proof for the historicity of David. There was a David. The question is not whether there was a David or there was no David. The question is whether the kingdom of David was a great empire.
The Bible clearly refers to an empire, which it describes as a huge territory with Jerusalem at its center. With much ceremony, King David transferred the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and thereby made it the capital of the kingdom. Therefore, King David really did exist. There is no doubt about it. He reigned in the 10th century BC. But was his kingdom the vast empire described in the Bible? Our investigation will continue in Jerusalem, the city of David, as it is referred to in the biblical text. Jerusalem is an unusual city, which has been destroyed and rebuilt many times. It is a living city, a difficult terrain for archaeologists. Is it still possible to find signs of David's capital? Given the difficulties, archaeologists have to proceed by going back in time. They begin with the latest remains, those that have been reliably dated, and go back to the older ones whose chronology is still uncertain. This time, our investigation will take us to cemeteries from the end of the monarchical period, which were built outside the city. Israel Finkelstein is going to try to find the remains of the Jerusalem of the 7th century BC.
Well, I haven't been here for 20 years. I don't remember how to pass anymore. It's somewhere over there. Should be. That's okay. During the Iron Age, the time of this cemetery, people buried, the dead were buried outside of the limits of the city. So by plotting the layout of the cemeteries in Jerusalem, what you get, in fact, is some sort of a circle around an empty area with no tombs, and that empty area, the negative print with no tombs in the center, is in fact the area of the city in the Iron Age.
Localizing these necropoli enables a map to be drawn up of the contours of Jerusalem at the end of the 8th and during the 7th centuries, the time of kings Hezekiah and Josiah. But this large city is the late Jerusalem, from the time when Judah was a prosperous state. What about David's city, which is 2 centuries older? The city that we are looking for has to be somewhere within these contours. Our investigation will focus on the ridge called Ir David, to the south of Temple Mount. It is here that archaeologists have been looking for King David's capital since the 19th century.
We are standing on the upper slope, on the upper part of the slope, down to the valley of Kidron. In the lower part, we see 2 or 2.5 houses from the late Iron Age. And above the houses is this very strange, I think, what we call the stepped structure. These are not steps to climb up a slope. This is just a revetment, a cover of a slope which is very loose, which is made of debris, which might, in a little earthquake or so, collapse down the slope and take with them whatever is standing above them. In the late Bronze Age and in the early Iron Age, there is human activity here. There's human occupation here on a very small scale.
The way I see it, there was a village here in the 10th century, but it was a small one, mainly on this part of the ridge of the city of David, not along the ridge, not all along the ridge, with a very limited population, not fortified, and with no monuments.
Well, I agree. I agree that it was a very small place. Iron Age Jerusalem was a very small, and this does not agree, or archaeology and text describe 2 different natures of sites, not the existence, but the natures of the sites.
Unlike the great city of the 7th century, David's Jerusalem was a simple mountain village covering 3 to 4 hectares.